Morning all, I had an interesting game last night. I was playing away at Royston, quite a long trek to get there. We all went as a team in the same car. 5-board match. Unfortunately we were a bit late. I think we had a bit of a time handicap. We gave a bit of a time handicap of about 15 minutes. Thankfully though we had all agreed adjournment was out of the question for the last game of the season and the distance. So all games were being played to the finish last night. I was playing Kevin Clark, dangerous player who I don't think I've beaten ever actually in the Herts League. And I was playing him with Black, so he kicks off with E4. I have drawn with him, I think, once or twice though. So, okay, so I thought I'd surprise him with B6 with a sort of French defence strategy later on. He played D4, he played very logically actually. After Bishop E7, Bishop D3, so he's just keeping his centre intact. Okay, after E6, C3. And you might think, well, maybe exchange off the light square, bishop, try and get onto the light squares later. Could be a plan for Black. After knight F6, Queen E2, especially with the Queen there, maybe it would be like nice to arrange, nevertheless, try and arrange bishop exchange later. So I had that in mind. Now I'm getting the traditional like weakened squares actually in the French defence here. So my counterplay should really be on the light squares later. And also I think in the French defence, usually my best results in this pawn chain, they haven't been very good results this season actually against this pawn chain. In fact, I've lost about 4 or 5 games in all leagues in the French. It's my main losing setup when there's a pawn on E5 it seems this season. Now if there is a liberating F6, as this game will later show, I think the importance of that, sometimes you can get a vulnerable pawn. If this pawn can actually get liberated, that might be a point of playing F6 or F file pressure sometimes. But so watch out for F6 later. But at the moment, you know, White is already starting to poke into the dark squares. And I think that's a key thing about this position. The exploitable weakness from the opening, the scene is kind of set that if Black can try and weaken White's light squares, and White can try and weaken, you know, the dark squares, that's the kind of square strategy is set by the pawn structure locked in horns here in the centre. He reinforces E5 with F4. I played G6 just to put a break on any potential F5. After knight F3, now Queen C8, so I'm trying to prepare Bishop A6. I'm not entirely sure this is the best plan actually. I have played this often with C5 in blitz, so maybe that's actually better with the idea of just Queen here, knight here, just forget about Bishop A6, just leave the bishop on this diagonal, castle Queen side. Maybe Bishop E7, H6 later, and be very careful when preparing the kingside attack. That's an alternative. But no, I played Queen C8, and he actually just plays B3, and this might be a very good response actually, because now any Bishop A6 there's C4 putting pressure on D5. So if we quickly, just before ruling out C5, let's quickly just check, try and check a concrete line here. So say C5, castles, 96. Is it? Let's just say White plays this. Now casting, there's always knight G5. That's a big problem, as well as knight A3 as well. There's no A6, so that's a bit of a disaster area in that position. So maybe you know there's some tactical problems with trying to castle queenside here. So basically B3, but I'm put off Bishop A6 a little bit because of C4. If I did play Bishop A6, okay, let's say C4, C5, exchange of light square bishops, but my pawns, I'm getting a very weak pawn here on D5 potentially, and White's got potentially menacing threats. But I think this is going to be White's going to be slightly better here, or clearly better. Pressure on D5. It looks a bit weak, this position. Okay, so let's go back. So I played actually c5, resisting the urge of bishop a6 for the moment. He castled after knight c6 now. Again, I'm putting that on hold, maybe later a5, bishop a6. Bishop a3, so he's going for my dark squares. If I don't really want to... there's no little trick at the moment with c4 because the knight's protecting a3. Unfortunately, didn't fall for any trick like that. I play a5, just carrying on with my plan. So he's really got his eye on these two actually. And believe it or not, okay, if these are considered exploitable weaknesses, potentially exploitable weaknesses, he wants to get, really, to exploit them, he wants to get knights on d6 and f6. And it's interesting how c4 might play a role in that, because if we trace the access route to d6 and f6, e4 might be a good access route if this pawn was knocked out, and that's why c4 might have significance, trying to make these exploitable weaknesses. So maybe this is something to bear in mind here, that e4 is the entry point to gain real access to these weaknesses. Otherwise they could remain theoretical. And from black's point of view, if we look at the light squares and this light square here, an entrance point is sometimes c5, a knight coming to c5 to e4. As far as this one, that's out of the question, unless there's like a maneuver like that. But no, that's the more critical, c5 to get to e4. Because this knight can't really get to f5 now that it's being chased like that. So e4 might be the potentially exploitable light square weakness with the entry route c5, and I'm hoping to reflect that in some of the variations. So e4 for whites, f6 and d6, and maybe c5. As far as knights getting into light squares, from black's point of view, c5 might be a point later. So rook c1 was played here, which I thought to some relief, because at least, you know, he's not preparing to smash me with f5. Bishop e7 now. And now queen f1, I thought that was curious, but actually in the Tarrasch lines, often g3 and bishop h3 are played. Here is queen is substituting a bishop on h3 and it's eyeing the sensitive e6. So it's sort of discouraging to potentially play f6 if e6 is actually becoming an exploitable weakness with this pressure diagonally. And there's a slight pitfall, of course, to this, and I was kind of over optimistic here about the power in this position of playing f6, but it has to be played with a brilliant follow-up, otherwise e6 is left as a weakness, and that's going to be a problem on this diagonal, as we're about to witness. After g3, he's really got a positional idea, as well as, you know, attacking ideas of knight g5 later, of just putting pressure on that weak pawn, which is a restrained pawn in this structure. But tactically, I could create some dynamic play here, and I should have given it more consideration. I took on e5, and actually maybe thinking, you know, this looks so logical because of the pressure on the f file. But I hesitated about sacking a knight for 2 pawns, and I think it's the natural thing to do. If you look at the sacrifice, it does a lot of things actually. White wants to play queen h3, so it will prevent queen h3. If we look now in this position, knight d takes e5, which unfortunately I didn't play, takes knight e5. Okay, he can't play queen h3. I'm also threatening to kind of liberate the position. For example, bishop e2, as though queen h3 might be on the cards now, but it can be stopped with knight takes f3, and now e5, liberating that pawn. So this gets an aggressive pawn center. This bishop could be useful in this diagonal later. The queen is stopping queen h3, so this offers, I think, the best chance. Let's say queen g4, queen g2 e4, knight d4, trying to use that pin looks like a nifty move. Bishop g5, let's say, and let's say white plays this move, sacrificing the exchange, because otherwise it could get very dangerous here with this check and rook f2. This is an engine line. If rook e1, say, just to demonstrate that, check rook f2, and that's big trouble, isn't it? Because whereas the queen's actually been tortured here, you know, there's rook takes e2 coming up with an attack on the queen. So if he sacrifices the exchange, if he's prepared to sacrifice the exchange to make sure e3 is covered as well, then again, this is better than the game continuation. And you know, black's got some dynamic compensation. I'm not claiming black's winning, but it's better than the game. There's chances for black here to get a very good position if white allows it. But unfortunately, in this position, I played passively, defending this weakling, and that's often the cause of position going downhill to start defending a weak pawn. And unfortunately, I'm preparing that queen e8. Before we go on from here, though, there was another plan apart from f6 to actually pursue this light square plan. And if you remember, I said c5 might be an entrance to e4. I think this variation demonstrates this. If we follow this line, c4, a lot of tension in the center here. So imagine at some point that I'm going to use c5 as an entry point to e4. It can occur in this line, exchange of light square bishops, and once this happens, this knight c5 to get into e4, also threatening knight d3. So knight e4, and black should be okay. So you know, basically, the square strategy dictated from the opening is, you know, leads to potentially, you know, exploitable weaknesses. But then the routes to those weaknesses need to be kind of planned out. But I think white's definitely planning out in this game the routes now into f6 and d6, which I underestimate. So the rook now goes to f1 after my, you know, protection of the pawn. I'm thinking, well, is he really threatening that? I just take, and then queen e7 and an e5 will drop. So I was optimistic, I was safe here. After a4, he plays c4, and we have got this, you know, potential plan of this knight coming in and eyeing these dark squares. And I didn't help matters now. I should have perhaps tried to remove one of white's knights with knight d4, and this should be okay, because again I'm getting this c5 square, which can act as an entry point into white's light squares, for example like this. And I've got this, you know, this knight c5 coming in this line is going to guarantee, you know, black's going to have a great game here actually. So again, this is very interesting, that the actual access route to the weaknesses needs to be carefully considered. Okay, but knight d4, a very powerful move. Unfortunately, I played knight b4 because I was very tempted with these diagonals, but they proved to be a bit of an illusion. He just took actually, and after c takes d, perhaps I shouldn't have played this check. It looks like a very bad idea, because again, you know, he wants this access to these dark squares, and I'm making it worse, this underlying square issue, with throwing in this check, which looks on the surface attractive, trying to get a pin on the knight and pressure, but he can parry that. If instead bishop takes d5, bishop e4, let's say I take here, it should be in this position. I think it should be okay for me, just about. Let's see, if I just take the queen, it looks as though that's okay. That's fine for black. That's just an idea of variation. It's not really white's best play. So bishop e4, queen f5, and that'll be much better than the game continuation. Unfortunately, in the game I played inferior bishop c5 check. Now bishop, let's be fair about bishop takes d5. So not being tempted by this check at all. So bishop c4, stronger move. And what's going on here? Again, knight c5 is echoing as an entry route into the white's light squares. But here white does have this pawn mobility and this weak pawn, not e6 here, pardon me. Knight d4, say white is slightly better, but it's better than the game continuation. Unfortunately, I play check, and the king actually supports the queen usefully now on h3. It's an important thing. I've driven the king to actually a good square, so this queen is like a substitute bishop in the Tarash line where it's like e6. So I take on d5, and he simply neutralizes the key diagonal, freeing his knight to now come to g5. And I make things again, unfortunately, I make things again worse. I need to be very careful about my dark squares and knight g5 here. And this move, to anticipate knight g5 in advance, would have been useful. Queen e7. So if knight g5 here, say bishop e3 attacking the knight, bishop d5 takes. And again, this should be okay. Again, the access to the light squares is available here, and there's no major disaster with the queen here supporting h7. Should be okay for black. But no, in the game I do make things a lot worse now for these dark squares. I take on e4. Unfortunately, I was also kind of experimenting the idea of switching off during the opponent's turn. I don't think that works for any games now less than 3 hours. It was a bad experiment. That I think I lost some key calculation time. I thought it was like be a novel experiment for the last game of Hearts League as an experiment, but I don't think it's an experiment I'm going to repeat. I'm going to try and work a bit harder for less than for club games. I think thinking during the opponent's time is also very important. But the underlying square issues from the opening, the exploitable weaknesses, is becoming so evident now. But just positionally, I just miscalculated it. I just thought Queen f5 optimistically that he would actually just take. In this case, if he did take, let's just check here. I think I'm getting away with this position. Should be okay here, but unfortunately this is a pipe dream. Let's say knight b8. It's sort of uncomfortable with this d file anyway in this position, but it's not so bad for black potentially, I think. Alright, let's keep the engine off, I think, for the remainder of this video. So once that comes back, that was a mistake. Okay, just to recap, so I've got some dark square weaknesses. Okay, we're back. Engine's going to remain off after that. Now, here, so Queen f5, optimistic. Knight fg5 is a very, very powerful move. He can take with his king. The king's useful, and he's going to remain attacking e6. I'm given very, very little time here to defend weaknesses. I didn't like that position at all. It's like very, very bad now for black. So say I did take and I try and defend this, then rook d7. How do I defend against knight f6 now? If here, say, just takes, check, and he's really celebrating f6, winning material. So it's a disaster zone, this position. I play h5, but it's a disaster. g4, forcing the queens off to win e6 now. After rook fc8, again I make things unfortunately a little bit worse here. I should have played in this position knight f8. I was scared about knight f6 check, but actually knight f6, king f7. It's better for white, but it's better than the game continuation. This position. He's going to win this g4 pawn at some point as well. White's still better, a lot better. So actually, this is starting to look very. It's gone downhill. This position. I play rook fc8, king f7. Otherwise, I just don't like the look of knight f6s. It's dire. He's winning the exchange now after this. Just picking up the exchange, and very good move now. Rook d4, targeting these pawns. So I thought I'd have some compensation for the exchange, but not really. He's mopping up my pawns, and very soon from this point on, well, it becomes hopeless, evident it's hopeless, the position, and he wins in a few more moves after this. So unfortunately, yeah, it's just racking up a few losses this season in the French defence structures, but they require, you know, I think a very deep understanding of light square weaknesses and dark square weaknesses and access points, and about, you know, f6 needing the right follow-up. Otherwise you do end up with just another weakness. When maybe if you're going to end up with another weakness, then maybe another plan's better. So yeah, I think I might try another opening next season. I've just lost, I think, about 4 French defence games in various horrific ways this season. In one league in particular, the Herts League, hasn't been my greatest, but still about 1-8-5 performance. So not a disaster. 4 wins, 4 losses, 4 draws, but not my best league by far. But this is just another game which shows something about a lack of understanding of exploitable weaknesses, really. The check really improving White's position, actually, with the queen now protected. So knight fg5 becoming a menace very shortly. So bishop e4, a very bad capture here, bishop e4. Not really sure what I was thinking there. Bishop e4. I'm just really inviting a knight into the dark squares. No, I think it was based on a miscalculation. Pardon me. I actually thought queen f5 and I'd be fine. It was a terrible miscalculation here. That queen f5, exchange of queens, and I should be okay with like the queen side pressure and the use of c5. And maybe even bishop d4 if the knight's not covering that. I was optimistic here about bishop e4 with the idea of queen f5, but it's not the case. A very, very powerful move here I missed. Knight fg5. It's just hitting e6. The exchange of queen here, hopeless because king takes h3. No time to defend just on the d file. This knight's just a monster on f6 and d6. Well, particularly f6. It's a terrible position. It's just gone really bad after knight fg5. So it's just going downhill here, and the rest is kind of technique. So once those weaknesses were invaded, just lost the exchange and hopeless. So I hope anyway it's instructive, this game. Yeah, French defence is black next season. I'm not sure about it. I think I need a new opening to lose with instead. But an experience about light squares, dark squares, and trying to, you know, free the position, freeing sacrifices. But it hasn't been working for me, the French defence, recently this season in the Herts League. Anyway, comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.